This is the Outer Worlds 2. I have been testing it out since it came out today, and we're going to be testing out, at least at first, the system requirements and how it actually performs. So I'm currently on the recommended system. I put in an RTX 3080 with a Ryzen 5 5600X. Now, they don't give us any target for like what sort of resolution, frame rate, graphic settings that should hit, so we'll find out in this video. I also have prepared a GTX 1070 to swap in partway through the video, see how that goes, and then we'll decide if it's worth testing out any other stuff. Now, as far as where I'm at in the game so far, I've completed the intro section, and I believe I'm about to go down to the first actual planet. And I am actually happy to report that the game's default settings have been going well so far, but I'm interested in how it's going to perform once we get down to a larger open world rather than the smaller confined spaces of the tutorial area. So far, I've been playing at 4K output resolution, but using DLSS Performance, which is rendering internally at 1080p, although it's more demanding than running at 1080p since there's the upscaling process that needs to happen from there. And it defaulted to high settings across the board, which is where I've been at, and it's been performant, actually kind of in the mid-70s average, but again, I think it's going to be more demanding as we get out to the open world. And I also would say that some of the shadows look a little bit weird at the high settings and almost look a little less grainy at like at some of the like medium settings, which is a bit weird. Maybe we'll talk about that more in a bit. But let's jump on down here. So far, I have not really had to deal with any particular like shader compilation stutter or anything like that. I'm curious if that's continuing to be the case as we get out into the open world, but it's actually been fairly smooth so far, at least on the recommended PC. And I'm curious how this is going to go. Looks like there is probably a shader compilation burn happening right there because we spiked to 100% CPU usage, and then it's loading in here. But again, as it actually loads in, I'll go ahead and start up the average frame rates. So the average frame rate is in the middle here. This is the current frame rate. This is the 1% lows. This is the frame time graph. The best way to judge the smoothness, I'm capturing footage at 60 FPS. So on a variable refresh rate display, you might not see screen tearing or judder. That will appear in the 60 FPS locked footage. We can also see all the CPU usage cores here. Again, remember we're on the 5600X. Which is no longer a super high-end CPU. You know, it was pretty powerful when it launched, 5 years ago or so at this point. It still was mid-range at the time. Anyway, so let's go ahead and get an idea of how it's performing. And I will say, yeah, we are now much lower performance now that I'm out here in the open world compared to where I was when the game opens up in the more enclosed area. Still averaging close to 60, but we certainly had some dips into the 40s there. 1% lows are currently a little bit kind of in the 30s. And companion abilities. Companion ability 1 with C, companion ability 2 with V. Let's go ahead and see what that does. Okay, so companion can do abilities. Okay, yeah, so, all right, we're going to be getting a whole bunch of stuff. Serenium is a dangerous zone. Okay. Let's keep on rolling. So like I said, this is going to be kind of a gameplay test. We'll see how it performs. See, we dropped into the mid-40s there for a second. It's kind of up again now, though. That's interesting. I'm wondering if that's repeatable. Are we getting CPU-limited shader compilation or loading in a new zone? Interesting. Yeah, so when we first transitioned up this hill, I saw performance dip into the 40s momentarily, but as I transition up this hill again, I'm not seeing that. That's interesting. So I think we're going to keep an eye on whether that continues to happen, and when it happens, is our GPU utilization dipping momentarily? Okay, yeah, performance dipped there for a second, then spiked back up. Anyway. Now, I may cut sections of this video if there's not a whole lot happening. So I've gone with some speech skills. This is an Obsidian game. I usually really like the writing and dialogue choices. So I'm going to attempt to go with kind of some speech-focused build. And that is my thought so far about this game is I tend to like Obsidian games. Usually the writing's very strong. So Anyway, I know the humor is not going to meet everybody's tastes, but I've been enjoying it so far. All right, we are now out of the conversation and heading into town for the first time. Performance dropping into the 40s, now into the 30s, yeah, and GPU utilization is not near 100%, so this is indicating CPU-limited performance. Now, I'm curious if it's going to stay that low or if it's going to stabilize, like if I stand still for a second. So if I stand still for a second, performance is a bit higher. We're kind of in the mid-50s, and we're mostly looking GPU limited. And then if I start running, let's see what happens. Yeah, GPU usage drops now into the 80s, at least for a moment, and performance dips again. And CPU utilization seems to spike. Yeah, we're even down into the 30s here. So yeah, sprinting through town, it certainly seems like we are really throttling the CPU, and that's kind of the limit on performance in the town area. So I think that's kind of my main thought on performance so far, is that the, yeah, we're definitely CPU limited performance there. The CPU is spiking, frame rate numbers are dropping, and yeah, unfortunately we're well below 60 FPS on that. So that's interesting. I think that's going to be the biggest problem for people on not super high-end new systems, is probably going to be that CPU performance. Looks like town areas are, I would imagine, like most games, going to be the biggest culprit for that kind of thing. Now, if I'm moving slower through town, I'm curious if we're going to hit things quite as bad or if it's a little bit more stable. See, moving slower through town, things don't seem to dip quite so badly. So it seems like sprinting through town puts a much bigger load on the CPU than when we kind of walk slowly through town. So maybe your play style could have a bit of an effect on that. I'm still definitely CPU limited, though, below 60 FPS, even walking. Now, if I sprint, let's see if it gets worse. Yeah, it does seem like we drop more into the 40s when I'm sprinting. Yeah, so unfortunately, I think that's going to be the biggest thing. And also, I don't have hardware ray tracing turned on at this point, which it defaulted to off, but also to be clear, the hardware ray tracing has even more CPU demand. So I think if I kick this on, things would get even worse on the CPU side thing, as well as the GPU side. But it would also be worse on the CPU side. Anyway, so that is going to be the problem. All right, so let's go ahead and see what happens. Wait, why is this in the middle between off and on? That's odd. So it seems like it takes a while to kick that on. Okay, seems like we're on now. Let's go ahead and try it with the ray tracing on. I have a feeling things are going to be pretty bad here. And yeah, even though ray tracing is super heavy on a GPU, considering we were already CPU limited in performance, look how bad this is getting now. We are dipping below 30 frames per second. But look, the GPU usage is well under 100%. So yeah, I'm going to definitely say ray tracing off, most likely, unless you're on super high-end hardware. It's looking like it will be relevant to test out a higher-end CPU with the 9800X3D and see what sort of performance we can get out of that. But again, we're switching hardware ray tracing back off. And let's go ahead and see if performance is stabilized. Yeah, after toggling that on and off, it's looking like we may need to... oh no, it toggled back on again. Okay, so it just didn't apply. I was going to say, it didn't seem to actually turn off. Let's see if it's actually turned off now. Yeah, performance seems to have stabilized. On some graphic settings changes and certain games, you do need to fully restart the game for things to apply. Which is worth noting. Now, I'm just curious, though, here, if we do just try going to all low settings, if it's going to be, if it's going to improve performance, or if we'll still be CPU limited regardless of how low the settings are. So I'm going to go just all the way to low settings. Let's give that a second to transition. Man, but unfortunately, it's looking like we're still short of 60 FPS. because it's CPU limited. Again, we can see that the GPU usage is well under 100%. Now again, best practice is to fully restart, so I am going to save the game here. We will fully restart in case that's just not allowing it to fully apply things and improve performance. All right, this is after a full restart of the game, and it is looking like we are still under 60 FPS sprinting through the town, despite being at the low settings. But again, we are not GPU limited, and the GPU is waiting and not fully utilized. Again, that's still a 4K output with DLSS Performance, but again, it's not seeming like the GPU is the limiting factor here. Again, hardware ray tracing off, everything to low. So it's looking like my biggest issue with performance is that it doesn't seem like there's enough scalability on the CPU. For people with, like a 5600X is a reasonable CPU. I would hope to get over 60 FPS in most games still. And the fact that we're under 60 FPS is a little bit frustrating. Now, we could go ahead and try out some lower resolutions, but again, it's looking like that's not really the issue here. Like I can drop to 1080p DLSS Performance, which is internally rendering at 540p and then reconstructing out to 1080p. Let's see if the resolution does anything for our performance here. But again, operating under the thought that we are not GPU limited, adjusting the resolution doesn't really help. You can see we're still a bit under 60 FPS. We're close to 60 FPS at the low settings. It is higher than it was at the highest settings, and wow, some things don't look great here. But again, we're we're at 540p internal, reconstructing out to 1080p at the lowest possible settings. So it seems like these graphic settings are probably giving a lot of scalability to the GPU. But yeah, not real happy with the CPU limited performance in town areas. Anyway, so I think what we're going to do next is I will try out the GTX 1070, which is the minimum requirement for the game. I'll leave it with the 5600X, and we'll see if maybe the 1070 can at least get close to that 60-ish FPS, or let's see if we'll be way more down at like 30 FPS at the low settings. And then I think it will make sense to move to a high-end system with a 9800X 3D CPU to see how the game scales when not CPU limited. All right, this is now the GTX 1070, which again is the minimum GPU on the system requirements. And let's go ahead and take a look at the settings that we've got it at, because we are below 30 FPS. So we are on 1080p output, and everything is on low. I've currently set the upscaling to none, which I think also means there's no anti-aliasing, which is why things are looking so pixelated. I know some people, I guess, prefer no TAA. Well, you have that option, but I wouldn't say things look great while doing it. Things look very pixelated, and again, we are below 30 FPS. So when they say minimum requirements, they do not seem to be indicating you can get 30 FPS at 1080p lowest settings. It's looking like we're going to have to use upscaling. Because we want at least 30 FPS. I'm not good with the mid-20s. So we're going to have to go with upscaling. Now, because this is a GTX card, not an RTX card, there's not going to be any DLSS available, but there is FSR. It looks like they have FSR 4, but version 4 isn't going to run on GTX cards, so I think it's just going to say that in the menu, and it should probably default to like 3.1. So we could start out with that, maybe go with quality mode to begin with, see if that gets us over 30 FPS, and go from there. So FSR quality on the 1080p output should be 720p internal rendering resolution, and it's looking like we're still a little bit under 30 FPS, closer to 30 FPS, but still a little bit under it. And the addition of FSR giving it some sort of anti-aliasing helps, although it's still looking a bit pixelated here. Now we are GPU limited, not CPU limited, so this is the limits of the 1070. You can see the GPU is pegged at 99% utilization, so it is definitely GPU limited here. Let's go down to balance. So we're further lowering the internal rendering resolution of the game to hopefully increase the performance on the GPU side of things. Looking like we are closer to 30 FPS now, dipped to 29 briefly. Again, got a little bit of a stutter there and a dropping into kind of the teens on the 1% lows, although quickly stabilized back to close to 30 FPS. So yeah, we're around 30 FPS. We could try going all the way to balanced mode, performance mode upscaling, see what that gets us. Reset the averages. Yeah, still just slightly over 30 frames per second. So it's certainly looking like the minimum GPU, like they're talking aggressive upscaling at 1080p output, well below 1080p internal rendering resolution, lowest possible settings to get about 30 FPS. And to be fair, I mean, I guess that is what minimum should mean, right? The lowest settings in the game, and it's maybe at a barely playable frame rate. But I mean, that's minimum. So there you go. Certainly not looking amazing. Now, maybe one of the other upscaling options would perhaps handle better, either performance-wise or image quality-wise. Like we could try TSR, see if Unreal Engine's own upscaler maybe performs a little better. Let's see how the balanced mode TSR does. Actually looking like TSR is a bit heavier. We are below 30 FPS at the balanced mode. So yeah, that's looking a little bit unfortunate. Let's see if, do we have XeSS? We do have XeSS. We could see if XeSS, now XeSS balanced mode, I think is the same internal rendering resolution as the other upscalers on performance mode. They've named the internal resolutions a bit differently in that. So I think this is actually the equivalent of performance mode upscaling on the other ones. Seems like it's another way to get us around 30 FPS, but again, image quality certainly not looking amazing here on the grass or anything like that. So anyway, I think that's the GTX 1070. We can confirm lowest settings, lots of upscaling to hit about 30 FPS. I think the next thing I want to do is test out a higher end CPU like the 9800X3D, just to see if you're on a high-end CPU, can we at least get high frame rates. All right, since it was having so much trouble performing on the 5600X CPU, I've not only switched over to a 9800X3D CPU, which in most cases is the fastest gaming CPU on the market. In certain games, some of the Intel CPUs are faster. But I've also put in an RTX 5090 so that we can try to see what the limits of the CPU are by putting in the most powerful graphics card. Now, currently, we're getting kind of in the mid to upper 80s. But what sort of settings are we using to get here? Well, this is still 4K resolution again, but I'm using DLSS Performance. Now, to reach the limits of the CPU, we might have to go to a lower resolution to relieve the burden on the 5090. We'll see how it goes. So right now we're at DLSS Performance mode, but at a 4K output. And then everything's on the very high settings. But again, it still defaulted to hardware ray tracing off, despite this being a 5090 and a 9800X3D. So it does still default to hardware RT turned off. Let's go ahead and get some little bit of performance testing at these settings. So I'll start up the averages and run around town a little bit, which was stressing the 5600X so badly. Let's see how this does. So it's looking like the GPU usage is 98%. So it is looking like this is GPU limited performance, not CPU limited performance. So the 9800X3D is not only giving us in kind of the upper 80s here momentarily, it's averaging a little over 80, with 1% lows around 60, but the 9800X3D I think could do better. It's just that the 5090 is actually limited to this performance, and that is DLSS Performance mode upscaling, and that's without the hardware RT. So this game does appear to be pretty demanding on the GPU side of things if you're at the very high settings at least, because the 5090 is not breaking 100 FPS even with performance mode upscaling. I'm actually curious if we back off to DLAA, which is native 4K resolution. I'm curious what our performance is going to look like here. Yeah, it looks like under 60 FPS, so kind of around 50, dropping into the 40s as we run around now. Yeah, so in the 40s, saw it briefly dip under 40. This is native 4K very high settings, which is the max preset, but without the hardware-based ray tracing. So that's what it looks like at native 4K on the RTX 5090. So yeah, certainly a demanding game on the very high settings. And if we switched over to like DLSS Quality, which on a 4K output, especially with newer DLSS models, is going to look almost indistinguishable from DLAA. Not the DLAA isn't slightly better, but if we take a look at this, that does get performance, looks like over 70. But again, this is on a 5090, so it's looking like the very high preset is going to be something to stay away from unless you're on an extremely high-end GPU. And of course, we saw the CPU side of things needs to be pretty high as well. Now, I do want to test out some lower settings, but also I do want to see what the limits of the 9800X3D are if we can. So to do that, we're going to drop the rendering resolution all the way down to 1080p, and I'll go DLSS Performance mode, which means that we'll be internally rendering at 540p, and then only using DLSS reconstruction up to 1080p output, which should drastically relieve the burden on the GPU, and it's a 5090. So let's see what we can get here and see if we reach the limits of the CPU. Wow, interestingly, it looks like we're still GPU limit. No, there we go. Okay, it did drop to around 93% there for a second. Now it's at 97%, 96%. So actually, it's still stressing the GPU pretty hard at this point. I was expecting to see a more obvious CPU limit. Okay, there, it dropped to 74% there for a second. So at least when we transition to a different zone on the town, yeah, 93%. So it's looking like this is a bit of a both a GPU and CPU limitation here. We're still not entirely CPU limited, but we're also not entirely GPU limited, and especially looks like, I think, when newer stuff loads in, we kind of see the limitation of both. I do think that's a bit unfortunate that we're not able to get much over 100 FPS on the RTX 5090, even at 540p internal rendering resolution. So yeah, seeming like the very high settings are extremely demanding. Of course, you don't have to use the very high settings, and that was still with hardware ray tracing turned off. I'm actually curious how bad this is going to be if we turn hardware ray tracing on. So let's kick that on. It looks like the game kind of freezes up for a second as it processes it. Let's go ahead and kick that on and see what performance looks like now. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. I'm going to give it a second, see if it just needs to sit. Maybe we should restart the game because we're under 60 FPS on a 5090 at 1080p output on a 540p internal rendering resolution. That can't be right. We are restarting the game. Okay, I have restarted the game now, and I'm getting the same performance, so it's not just needing to restart the game. I am on an RTX 5090 and a 9800X3D, 1080p output, DLSS Performance, 540p internal rendering resolution, hardware ray tracing on, very high settings, and I am not able to get 60 FPS. That means that this is like more demanding and more stuttery, look at the 1% lows, than like Cyberpunk with path tracing. So I don't know what's going on. I don't know why it's this demanding, but I think we can just safely say there is no hardware right now where turning on hardware ray tracing in this game makes sense. So again, turn off the hardware ray tracing, and I think performance is going to spike back up over 100 FPS. So it is definitely the hardware ray tracing that was causing that massive performance loss. I don't know. I don't know. So basically, I think they maybe should have just left that option out of the game because it certainly doesn't seem to be anything that anybody's going to be able to use. Are you getting the same performance on your system? Is something wrong with mine? That certainly seems pretty bad. Last thing I want to try out is with hardware ray tracing off, what if we drop to the high preset? Because in the vast majority of Unreal Engine 5 games, the high preset looks very close to the max preset and performs a lot better. That tends to be the case. Looks like here we're getting, still a bit over 100 FPS. Man, it's looking like now we're more CPU limited. Yeah, look, the GPU is at like 80 something percent utilization. So yeah, it's looking like in the town environments, the 9800X3D is actually going to be the limiting factor at just a bit over 100 frames per second. So what's my overall conclusion with this game? Well, other than the hardware ray tracing, I just leave that off. I think there is a lot of scalability on the GPU side of things. And like I said, until I got into this town environment, the RTX 3080 was actually putting up a pretty good fight at high settings and things like that. So I don't think that the GPU side of things is that bad, minus the hardware ray tracing. But the CPU side of things in a town environment certainly seems like that's going to be a bit disastrous for a lot of people. And I think that that's going to be my performance assessment on this game. So yeah, I think you can definitely play this game on a lot of hardware, but I think that, yeah, in town environments, CPUs are going to be hit pretty brutally, and it's going to be hard to maintain high refresh rates. Again, here, even on the 9800X3D, it's seeming like little over 100 FPS in a town seems to be the limit, because the 5090 is no longer the bottleneck there. All right, that's all I've got time to test out here because my kids are home, and I'm going to go give them some attention. But I am enjoying the game so far, and I do like that I've not seen a lot of shader compilation stutter. So it seems less stuttery than most UE5 games, but just that performance ceiling, especially CPU limited, is certainly leaving something to be desired. I hope all of you have an excellent day.